recording. So we don't actually have anything to do today. No, we don't have anything due today. We have things to do. But I wanted to point this out really quick because I know some people may be doing quadruped animation if you're repeating the class for credit. So I put some references up here if you're interested in them. Even if you're not, they're really cool references. You can check them out. But if we go into content and look at our schedule, you see that today we actually don't have any homework due. It's due next class period. So we'll actually have quite a bit of work time after the lecture today where you can be continuing to work on that. On top of that, we're also going to go ahead and I'm still going to have you break up into groups to meet with your groups, but instead of doing that at the beginning of class, we'll go ahead and put that off until after the lecture. And then basically what we can do is break up into your groups, and then as your groups are finishing up, then the rest of class is yours, however you want to use it. I wanted to point out something about this date, though, the 6th. We have our homework due and not a lecture on that day. Probably what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of time to, actually I realize there's some videos we could also watch the next day. But I'm going to give you a little bit of time to meet up with your homework groups, and then the rest of the class is open work time for you. I'm doing that intentionally because something else is happening on that day. Did anybody else get an email about it?
Governor Bill Lee.
Yeah, we're getting a visit from the governor. Yeah, that's going to suck. Just because everybody's going to be parking's going to be blocked off. Like it's good. Apparently they have to come through the building like at 4 and do like a security check. And so my thoughts is I want to be out of this building as soon as I possibly can on Thursday. And so we're going to do the homework early on and meet up with your groups. And then after that, you're welcome to hang out here and work, but I don't want to keep you till 5:05 and then you get like stopped in some motorcade or something going out of here. So we're going to have kind of a lighter day that day, mainly just turning in the homework and meeting with your groups. So you get a little bit of time over the next few days to be working. I probably am going to put, and I'll go ahead and put this in there now just so I'll remember, a really short lecture here where we go over that last video where I'm doing the polishing. We may try to squeeze that in next class period, but probably not. It's actually would be really short. But we'll probably wait till the Tuesday before it's due. That'll kind of give you that last little reminder of some of the stuff to be working on toward the end. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to be giving a lecture over overlapping action, on overlapping action, about overlapping action. Primary monitor. So since this is mainly just me talking and you kind of, like this is a lecture day more than walking you through something, and it's not going to have anything to do with me opening up Maya or walking through any of that. So if you're interested, you're welcome to scoot to the front. That way it's not, me having to yell at the back of the room. But if you don't want to scoot to the front, that's cool. I'm actually broadcasting on Zoom as well and recording it on OBS. So I'll be uploading it here in a second. How many of you are, we talked about ECGC the other day. How many of you think you might be interested in that? So last year, we actually took the trip to ECGC, and the faculty who go sometimes will try to do talks or something like that for the conference. So this is actually from a talk that I gave then, kind of about stuff that I was noticing in my classes, which was people really struggling with the idea of overlapping action. So I put this together because that is probably one of the things that that makes student work look like student work and not professional work more than anything. I don't want to say more than anything. I think posing is also a big part of it. but it is a very telltale sign when something is kind of stiff. That feels like you haven't quite got the hang of it yet. And that's one of the hurdles I want to try to get past, or get you past, is having a stronger understanding of overlapping action. So having said that, this is still the same PowerPoint I gave at that presentation. So there are elements of it that, like, you already know, like who I am, right? So just in case you were curious, like, this is who I am. And here's some more about me. But really the presentation as it applies to you kicks off here, and you all are probably pretty familiar with this. Anybody own this book?
Yes, we did.
It's a good one. It's expensive, but this is like ask for it for a birthday or Christmas present or whatever. It's a good book. Why is this book significant?
Because it invented the 12 principles of animation.
Yeah, well, it's at least the first place we saw them, right? It's the first place that that it was like sort of released to the public, right? So, quick recap: the 12 principles of animation were sort of the 12 principles, or were sort of these rules that the 9 old men at Disney developed at their time there throughout sort of the early days of Disney to understand why animation worked the way it did and to help them teach it to new people as they came in, right? Well, this was sort of this was something that they kept in-house until I think 1981 when Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston wrote this book, and this is the first time it was like put down in paper that people were just able to go buy a book that had the rules in it. So every time I teach about the 12 principles of animation, though, we're not going to go through all of them again, because you probably have multiple lectures about that. But every time I teach it, this is the one that really pops out, follow through and overlapping action, because it's confusing. Right? Because there are so many different phrases that we can use to refer to this, and they seem like we're kind of using them interchangeably, but at the same time, they each kind of mean something different. And like, what do we even mean by follow through and overlapping action? Well, Frank and Ollie, when they were sort of addressing this in the book, they pointed back to a meeting with Walt, where they were reviewing some work, and the critique that Walt had was this. He said, things don't just stop all at once, guys. First there's one part and then another. And he was recognizing that in their drawings, they were hitting a pose, but everything was stopping at that pose at the same time. And that was sort of the beginning of them starting to unravel how follow-through and overlapping action worked. Now, in most cases, it falls into one of 5 categories. They kind of break this down in the book. Stuff like appendages, ears, coat, hair, things that are all kind of moving differently because they're reacting, right? We call that overlapping action. The body shouldn't move together, so we get like parts of the body will stretch and other parts will catch up, and that's lead and follow. And so we'll dive more deeply into these. Don't worry about them too much right now. Loose fleshy areas. So a good example of this might be like a bulldog that has like really like low hanging like jowls. Like when they move, that part will sort of drag behind and flap. Hair, stuff like that might also be another part of that. And what's happening there is they're dragging behind because those parts are lighter than the main mass. There's motion after the action. So after an action stops, stuff still continues to move. That'd be follow through or overshoot. And then moving holds, which means what we talked about before, like not everything just freezes to a stop. Parts ease in at different paces, and we get like the settle to a stop, right? So the problem with this principle is that it encapsulates so many different things. And you will hear animators using all of these different terms to refer to follow through and overlapping action, right? There's drag, successive breaking of joints, offset, lead and follow, overshoot, like all of these different things that we will use kind of interchangeably are all applying to this one principle, are all like encompassed within this one principle. So really that's what this talk is about, is demystifying what we're actually talking about with this principle. And like almost everything in animation, we can usually lead that back to physics. So how many of you have taken physics? Okay. How many of you still have to take it again? So, I took it twice, and it's probably the class that our students complain about the most. And really, I think for the most part, it's because the math parts of it, not necessarily because we hate Isaac Newton. And actually, I find physics fascinating. I just have trouble with calculations of stuff, right? So specifically, the part of physics that we can apply to this, or that applies to follow-through and overlapping action, is Isaac Newton's third law of motion. Anybody remember what that one is?
Objects in motion have to stay in motion. Is that the one?
Until acted upon by force. No, I think that one's the first one, isn't it? Second?
The first one is objects at rest, stay at rest.
Yeah, but then it's the same. Object at rest, stay in rest. Object unless acted upon by force. Yeah.
Objects have an equal opposite.
Yeah, and then force times mass. But yeah, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So it's interesting because they're all interchangeable, right? Or not interchangeable, but interconnected, right? But essentially what we're saying here is energy in equals energy out, right? If I push on a wall, that's an action, right? That energy I'm putting into that has to go somewhere, and the reaction for that is me moving, right? Or the wall moving if I'm pushing hard enough. And that's the reaction. So the action is pushing, the reaction is me moving in return, right? So how many of you have seen this image before? I bet you've seen this in maybe one of my previous classes. I don't know if Laura Osteen shows this in her class or not. So just in case, we're going to go over it one more time, kind of more quickly. This is a still image from a video that's going to play here in a minute. And what he's done is he's let a slinky sort of find equilibrium, right? It's stretched out to its where it's going to be like kind of neutral. You know, it's like you just kind of let it bounce until it's settled, right? But in a second here, he's going to release the slinky at the top, right? So for those of you who haven't seen it before, the real question I want you to be asking is, what do you think will happen at the bottom? So when he releases that slinky at the top, what's going to happen at the bottom? Anybody who hasn't seen this before have a guess? Has anybody not seen this before?
I don't think I did.
Yeah. So what do you think is going to happen to the bottom of the slinky when he releases it?
It's gonna match the top.
So as soon as he lets go of the top, the bottom, the whole thing will just fall as one unit?
No, it'll like jump backwards.
Oh, so like collapse toward the center?
Yeah.
All right. So I think there are really three. What do you think's going to happen?
Doesn't it just stop at the bottom?
So just sort of stay there?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's really three options, right? It's either going to fall with the top at the same time, it's going to merge toward the center, or it's going to stay in place until the top catches up with it, right? So let's watch what happens when we hit play here. So the bottom stays exactly in the same location and doesn't move at all, right? Until the top catches up with it. Why is that? Because it's haunted. Slinkies are haunted, as everyone knows. So no matter how big of a slinky you have, this is what will happen, right? You release it at the top. That bottom stays perfectly still. Right? So the reason for this is because releasing the slinky is a signal, right? And that's a signal that like we're no longer being supported by this guy's hands, right? It takes a finite amount of time for that signal to reach the bottom. So the bottom doesn't know it's been let go yet. Does that make sense? Like it still thinks we're being supported because the signal that it's been let go has not made it to the bottom until the slinky makes it to the bottom, right? So again, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. There's an amount of time that it takes for that action to travel to cause the reaction to happen. Now, in a lot of cases, me pushing against the wall, it's almost instantaneous, right? But I mean, there still is like just a fraction of a microsecond or whatever that information still has to trickle up my arm before it drives me to one side, right? So there's an action and then an amount of time for that information to travel to the end of that slinky before the reaction of that slinky dropping. we can see this pretty clearly from these guys who get paid lots of money to hurt themselves. So there's people peeking in the back door, and I'm sure they're like, what? Anybody ever watch any of these videos, the slow-mo guys?
I watched them a lot when I was younger.
Yeah, they're a lot of fun, but they're really fun for animation purposes because we can watch that action that just happened right there. We can watch that in super slow motion, right? And like when we watch it, we're like, oh, that was a kind of a hard hit, but you can tell he's okay, right? Like he just kind of stumbles a little bit. But let's watch it in slow motion. So the cool thing to watch here is when parts, like the ball has already hit him, right? But parts of his face have not found out yet. The tip of his nose has not been informed we have been struck by a soccer ball, right? Like his lips are still like kind of in the same location. And then it just takes a little bit of time, even though like in real time it's really fast, right? It takes a little bit of time for all of that information to catch up. Right? And that's why we get drag. His lips and his nose are dragging behind. Even just the skin on his face, right? When Frank and Ollie said loose skin, this is kind of what they're talking about. That stuff doesn't all move at once. I love this though. His lips catch up and then pass up the rest of his face. Like, so does his nose. This is what we're talking about in follow through and overlapping action. It's just happening really quickly, right? So, how do we implement this, right? So let's talk about something a little more boring, like this very stiff, boring stick running from one side of the screen to the other, right? Coincidentally, in ETSU colors. So, I was giving a presentation at a conference. It was like a promotion. Do it?
It's also Ravenclaw colors.
Exactly. That's really what I was going for. Ravenclaw doesn't give me a paycheck. So really, this is boring. This has no overlapping action, no follow through. It's just two key poses, right? It's on one side of the screen. It's on the other side of the screen, transitioning evenly, right? When we're trying to add in overlapping action, really what we're talking about is one part moving before another part and that other part not receiving the signal until a little bit later, right? So for example, if I wanted it to look like the bottom of this was leading the action, then what I could do is go halfway in between and make a breakdown key of my, my stick kind of leaning back, right? And because then it's going to look like the bottom is leading, right? The bottom is pulling it across, the top is dragging behind. And just by adding that one extra key, I can get that, right? So we kind of get this illusion of some drag happening in there. Right? Now, on top of drag, we could also add some overshoot. And overshoot is when we go past our final keyframe and then settle back, right? We shoot past our destination and then settle back into it. And so I could do that just by adding another keyframe with some overshoot, right, with this. And so now we have 4 keyframes, and we get that. So just those 2 extra keyframes really change the way this animation feels. Right? Now it still needs a little bit of work. There's a little bit of things we can do to this. Now imagine that this isn't a stick though. Imagine that this is a shape, right? Like like maybe your character's head, right? Then we can do some of this just with rotation, right? That this feels like part of the object, part of this sphere is leading another part of the sphere. It feels like we're leading with the bottom of the sphere. And it feels like that, and if this were our character's head, maybe that's our chin, it feels like we're leading with our chin and the top of our head is sort of overshooting, right? And so we get that. So this also feels kind of lazy, right? It's like it's dragging the sphere across and it settles, right? So recognize that this overlapping action, and what we're talking about here is lead and follow. This is something we can use to change the way this motion feels, right? If I led with the top instead of the bottom, like we think of that as more like the head of this stick, right? And this feels more urgent, right? It's trying to hurry up and get there, right? And that's just one breakdown key. So, but of course this is just one body. This is just one stick, right? And in most cases, when we're talking about overlapping action, we're talking more about a hierarchy, right? Multiple sticks, right, that are all connected together. So we can think of this as like shoulder, elbow, hand, fingers, or something, right? Or even a tentacle or something, right? So to add this same feeling just with a pose, we have this stiff version of this, we can still just add this drag pose by rotating each part of that hierarchy just a little bit, right? So now we get this curved feeling, and that would make it a relatively strong drag pose, just like we could add a little bit of follow through or overshoot to get it to shoot past. And just by doing that, we get something very similar, except it's, now it's got that curve to it, right? Keep in mind though, this is still just 4 keyframes, and all of these 4 sticks have keyframes on the same frames. They're all hitting at the exact same time. We've just put drag into this to make it feel looser, right? To sort of accentuate some of that. So another technique we can use to this is to offset the frames in which those keys are on, right? If all of the keyframes were on the same, frame 1 for all 4 of those segments, then if I just go down the hierarchy and shift those keyframes 1 frame later, then they're not all hitting at the same time anymore. They sort of cascade one after the other. And so if I offset the first one, or the second keyframe or the second segment by 1 frame, third by 2 frames, fourth by 3 frames, then we get something that looks just a little looser. But keep in mind, we don't have to settle for just 1 frame of offset. We can offset it 2 frames, 4 frames, 6 frames, and we're going to get something that's much looser, right? And so we really kind of notice it on the overshoot more than anything, right? So what we're getting is a combination of building some semblance of that drag and overshoot into the pose, and then accentuating it with some offset to make it feel more loose, like it's not all hitting at the same time. Of course, we're working in the pose-to-pose method. And the pose-to-pose method is great for some stuff, right? It's great, but of course the method is you're putting keyframes on all of the body parts on the same frames, right? And that's great for setting up our timing. It's great for setting up like our planning of the shot. It's great for being able to focus on individual poses, but it's really bad for overlapping action, right? Because that drawing that we get to here at the end is going to feel like everything hits at once, right? This is what Frank and Ollie were talking about. Is as we get this transition, we have to start thinking about how different parts of the body get there at different times. This is particularly challenging for those of you who are doing 2D animation, right? Because it's very easy for everything to hit at the same frame. Sometimes you have to plan it out a little bit and be like, well, I'm actually going to have the arm go past, and when the rest of the body can get there, the arm will go past, but then the arm will settle back over 2 or 3 frames, right? For 3D animation, sometimes we can shift those keyframes a little more easily. So let's talk about offsetting. We have all these objects. They're actually these little cylinders that are just going up and down. It's really just 2 keyframes. I'm going to skip this next one because it's accidentally left in there. And if we were to look at those 2 keyframes in the graph editor, they would look like this, right? It's just this sine wave going up and down. And all of them, like you only see this one curve because they all have the same curve, right? They're all doing exactly the same thing in the up and down axis, right? But if I were to go back and offset these by 1 frame each, right? If I were to say add 1 frame, or slide all of them from the second one down, slide that 1 frame down on the timeline, add 2, add 3, add 4, then the result is not going to be this anymore. The result's going to be this. And that's just by offsetting them 1 frame each. And if we were to look in the graph editor at this, with all of those selected, we would get this. Right? And you can see what's happening is they're all hitting that same point. It's still the same animation. They're just hitting it at a different time. Right? Now the method in which we offset it though can really change that, right? Obviously I can offset it by 2 frames each, right? We get this much looser floppy thing, right? And I think it's interesting to notice that that first key going up, or that first cylinder going up and down, this second one doesn't get to that same keyframe until 20 frames later, right? So it's really loose feeling, right? But the other thing we could do is we could just offset them in different orders, right? If I left the outside one going straight up and down, and I offset by 1 frame moving inward toward the center, then we get something like this, right? So I think all that makes sense. Hopefully that's making sense. So let's look at something like this. Again, it's still the same 2 keyframes, right? It's rotating from point A, rotating to point B, back again, right? It's just 2 keyframes over and over again. And with that rotation, I can again offset 1 frame down the hierarchy and have that rotation happen 1 frame later, and I get this, which just feels a little less stiff, right? If I offset 2 frames down the hierarchy, 2, 4, 6, it gets even looser. And then, of course, if I go to 3 frames, it gets really loose. This one's, it's a little drunk. So recognize what I've been doing, if we go back here and look at this, is I'm taking all those keyframes and I'm shifting them further in time, like later in time, right? They're happening 1 frame later, or 3 frames later, right? Later isn't my only option, right? I could also go from this stiff one, like that we had earlier, everything's hitting at the same time, and I can make it, instead of 1 frame later, 2 frames later, I can make it 1 frame earlier, right? And so what that's going to do is that's going to mean that last segment on the hierarchy is going to arrive at its destination 3 frames earlier than the first one, right? And so the result of that's going to start feeling a little different, right? It's going to feel a little more searching, right? It's like it's looking for something, right? I like to think that these kind of like, you know, we can go 2 frames earlier, or 4 frames, 6. This is starting to look like a worm or something, like looking for something. Like, you ever see how a worm moves around? Think of like earthworm popped up out of the hole and it's looking for something, right? And you get that feeling because it feels like it's being pulled around by the end, right? It feels like the end is like what's sort of dragging the entire form around. We can go even longer, and we're starting to almost get like a fish motion, right? Like this like wave of a fish going through. Okay, so back to this thing, right? Now, I think it's important to recognize these are 2 keyframes, and if I were to cascade down this, down the hierarchy and offset those keyframes by 1 frame, 2 frames, 50 frames, it doesn't matter. This is still the animation we're going to get because there's no change in the pose, right? So just offsetting doesn't fix anything. Offsetting changes the timing in which we get to a different pose. So some of this stuff I can control without having to do offsetting at all. Like I could just make a more dynamic pose. So if we kind of look back and forth between these 2, right? What I'm going for here is it looking like the bottom moves first and the top hasn't received that signal yet. Very similar to the slinky, right? The top is still like, hey, I'm just hanging out, and the bottom's already on its way, right? I could go a little further and put another breakdown with this, something like this, and it feels like the bottom is still moving, still dragging this, or still leading this motion, and the top has finally sort of gotten the signal, we're moving, and it's kind of followed through, flipped on around, right? And just by adding those 2 keys, I get this, right? So again, this is no offsetting at all. This is just those 2 keyframes. And then, again, I can offset down the timeline, 1, 2, 3 frames, and get something like this. Right? So that dynamic posing is part of it as well, right? We can't expect offsetting to really make our animation better if the animation isn't already strong, right? Now, I think it's worth recognizing that a lot of people get follow-through and overlapping action confused with secondary action. And it's because they're kind of interconnected. Secondary action is one of the other principles, but a lot of times secondary action is what I like to think of as like residual motion, right? that main mass is bouncing, and even if those limbs aren't swinging around or grabbing at something, they would still react, right? They still have to kind of have some motion to them, right? Or it just doesn't feel right, like there feels like something's wrong there. So we need like a little bit of like bounciness to them to feel like they're reacting to the fact that the main mass is moving. So sometimes overlapping action is just residual motion that comes from being connected to something else, right? And I think that's interesting because our bodies are not, like my arm doesn't exist by itself, right? My arm is always, hopefully, attached to my torso, right? And otherwise, so whenever I move my arm, that's going to affect my entire body in some way, right? And this is something that you see a lot of people do kind of incorrectly, is they will just set keyframes on the arm, and like the character is like stone still, and the arm is waving. But I mean, look at Forrest, like it's moving his whole body that he's waving like that. And to be fair, he's waving pretty, enthusiastically, but it's Forrest. So, but I mean, even like look at his chest. Like you can see like muscles sort of bouncing in his chest, his head's moving around. His whole torso is moving because it's connected to this flopping arm, right? So I think that that's important to recognize, is that we're a system of organs and parts that are connected together that all affect each other when they move. Okay, so let's look at some actual animation. How do we apply some of this to character animation? So I have a couple of different steps that I did here. Let's start with this one. This is pretty casual. I like to think it's like you're standing in line at Starbucks and somebody says, hey, I need to get to the cinnamon roll behind you or whatever. Like, oh, pardon me. It's like, I'll step out of the way for you, right? So it's not very urgent, not very eager or anything like that. And so if we were to sort of diagnose this in the terms that we say leading and following, right? He's leading with his hips, and then his upper body, arms, and head are sort of following. They're dragging along behind, right? The hips kind of shift over and pull the rest of his body across. Now, really, if we talk about what's leading, his foot kind of leads a little bit, right? But this is a really cool rig. Anybody using the Bony rig for any of this stuff? Yeah. So the cool part about the Bony rig is you can turn parts of it off, right? And so we can see this animation just with the lower part of the body. And when we break this into lead and follow here, you'll also recognize that this is sort of the splining passes that we talked about earlier, the root motion in the feet, right? That foot is sort of leading the motion because that foot has to get out there to catch the character before the hips can shift across, right? And then the hips come next, and then finally the other foot catches up at the end because that other foot is having to continue to push him as he makes that step. The torso is really interesting to me. You all did the pendulum exercise, and really if you look at this is just like the upside down pendulum, right? The hips are leading this, and the torso is kind of just dragging along behind it, and that's what's giving it that casual, not urgent feel, right? So what I like to do is I like to think of torsos as a series of, if I had just stopped this sentence there, I just like to think of torsos. That's what I like to do, just think about torsos. So if we were to just think about this character's torso and head, we can really define it by three main masses, right? We got these, the hips, the rib cage, and the head, right? And those are the three masses that kind of lead and follow when we're looking at an animation or when we're just thinking about how a character moves. So we'll start by like the hips start moving first, right? That first frame, the hips sort of surge over just a little bit and start leading the character moving in that direction. And we'll see that slowly the ribs start to catch up with it, right? But the head is dragging behind. The head is really just sort of like taking its time before it finally starts to move too. Well, then the hips change direction, right? Start going in the other direction, but the head hasn't gotten this signal yet, so it still continues to follow through, right? And then eventually starts to catch up and go in this direction, right? And then again, the hips sort of arrive and everything sort of cascades. The hips are changing directions again. The head and the chest continue to go that direction. And then we eventually kind of settle to a stop. Of course, the hips get there, and then the chest and the head still continue to kind of follow through, right? So, on top of that motion, we have the arms. Why are the arms not playing? Let's try that again. There we go. And so the arms are kind of just dragging behind on all of this, right? The arm kind of, I guess the character's left arm kind of starts that motion a little bit, but for the most part is just sort of reacting to the way the torso is moving. Okay, let's try another step. Let's try this guy. Completely different type of step, right? This is like you're dodging, or not, it's not even dodging, it's like he's eager to get over there, right? Maybe he has to step into the circle in order to volunteer, right? And he's excited about volunteering. I also put a little bit of extra squash and stretch in this to make it make more sense. So let's break this apart into its parts as well. So again, you can really see the lead and follow here. That foot really has to get out there in front of him before he can take that step across. Right? And then the foot kind of slaps down at the end, right along with the hips. Right? So it's running just a little bit on the late side on slapping. But the torso is where it's really interesting to me, right? So we break it apart into this again. It's the opposite. The head is leading most of this action. So if we watch almost immediately, well, the hips kind of pull back, right, to sort of squash up for this anticipation, and then watch the head starts to move forward in this next frame, right? And the head is kind of jabbing forward throughout this whole thing. Right. It even continues by jabbing kind of upward here. And if you look at it, what it feels like is like the hips are like bunched up behind it, pushing it, right? And so that's making it feel like the head is like being sort of nudged forward, right? But it's in the lead. And so the head is kind of going to lead us along this arc that the body takes. Now look at, I want to back up a little bit here. Look at the distance between the pelvis and the rib cage. Right now they're practically touching, but then right here, they start spreading out, right? So when we talk about squash and stretch, we're really getting some stretch keys here, right? Particularly as the hips start moving back toward the ground, you'll start to see the torso stretching out there. And then as we get closer to the ground, we'll see that it squashes back together. Particularly if you're doing a quadruped, this is really important. Like this is really like where you get all of your squash and stretch is the distance between those three main masses. And then sort of the rest of it is just the character sort of settling. The head does kind of drag behind there just a little bit and just kind of settles into place. Oh, not too far. Go back one more. Here we go. So the arms have something a little more dynamic going on. The character's left arm is kind of leading that motion, kind of jabs forward with the finger to kind of like almost show you the direction he's going. But the right arm is really just kind of dragging behind, right? And it even kind of hits that down point a little bit more cascading like that. So thought I'd pull up a couple of examples of where you can see this in actual animations. This is something from my demo reel, actually a couple of these from my demo reel, where the hips are leading this action, the chest and head kind of comes next, but the very last thing that gets there is the hand, right? And that makes it feel like this whip action, right? It's like a slap, or even a baseball pitch, right? This is a way of making sure that when that hand does finally reach its destination, it's got a lot of energy behind it because all of the rest of the character's body built that energy up into it. And then the follow through is where the smack is, right, where the hit is. We could also look at, this is actually in one animation, there's two different gestures she does. So the first one is this one, which is this very throwaway gesture, right? She's sort of rotating her upper arm first, her elbow last, or her elbow second, her hand and fingers last, right? And it's kind of getting this cascading down the hierarchy. The result of that is this feeling of like she's dismissing you, right? It's a throwaway gesture. I don't get out of here, right? You're you know, like it's very almost insulting or dismissive, right? The opposite of that is the very next gesture she makes, where she's making a point about something. She's very she's said something that was significant, and so you'll see this with her arm gesture. Her finger leads that motion, and then her hand next, and then her elbow. So it's actually the opposite. The hand is leading the action, and the upper arm is following. And in fact, her head is sort of the last thing that kind of hits the up pose. You kind of see it happen almost a couple frames later. So I think it's important to recognize that it's not all or it's not either or, right? It's not different parts of your animation, different things will lead and different things will follow. And some of that is with offsetting and some of that is with the posing. To get this, I still had to animate the pose as if her hand were leading that. And then I used some offsetting in order to make some of that stuff happen a little bit earlier. Now, I think the most important part about all of this, though, is Maya didn't do it, right? The animator did it. Maya's just a tool, so and so is Toon Boom. Like, this is still something that is up to you. Overlapping action is an element of the natural way that things move, but how you use it in your animation is a creative choice, right? And it can drastically alter the way that animation is perceived. So an animator's job is to have control of these tools. It's just a tool, right? And so that's one of the things that I think makes a student reel that has good overlapping action in it impressive, is it shows that you've gone that deep into it. You've mastered that tool. You've not just mastered the basics of Maya and lucked into some good animation. You are actually making conscious decisions about the way things follow through and overlap throughout the whole process. So again, my name is Greg Marlowe, and if you would like to add me on LinkedIn, you're one of actually, you are more than welcome. How many of you have a LinkedIn? All right. That means the rest of you need to hurry up and get a LinkedIn. I know, like, you need another social media in your life, right? I think it's something like 70% of all new jobs. I may just be making this statistic up, but I'm pretty sure I read it somewhere. It's something like 70% of all new jobs come from some form of social connection that you have, or some sort of connection. And LinkedIn is, like, LinkedIn doesn't really have competition. Like, everybody is on LinkedIn for a job. I honestly don't even write resumes anymore when I'm applying to jobs. I just send them my LinkedIn page. And there's actually even a button on LinkedIn that will turn your LinkedIn page into a resume in case somebody wants one, right? But it's a really good way of making connections and stuff like that. That's actually one of the reasons we do these trips to ECGC. And I'm kind of trying to come up with my next talk for that too. So if there's anything specific y'all are interested in hearing more about, let me know, and I may put together a talk on that. So, but in all seriousness, any questions on this? Any, like, overlapping action is something that confuses a lot of people. So I want to give y'all some time to sort of chat about it. Some questions? The presentation is just that good. Like, you have answered every question I've ever had about overlapping action. All right, y'all. Well, if you do have questions, that's cool too. We can still talk. What I would say, I'd like to give y'all a little bit of time now. So I still have one more thing I want to do, but not today, which is go through the last of those videos of me working on the little girl doing the backflip. I kind of forgot to do that in my previous class because we got kind of snowballed into some other stuff. So I'm probably going to do that not the next class, but the class after that. Feel free to watch ahead on those if you want to, but I'll walk us through them on like a week from today, which will be the class before the project's due, but it'll be a really short lecture. And that's sort of me tying up all the loose ends on that project. Hopefully you all be to a similar point at that point. So nothing was due today, but what I would like to do is give you all a chance to break up into your groups and just have a conversation and see, if you want to get some more feedback from some people, if you want to show some people your progress. I think it's actually pretty healthy to have that conversation pretty often, So kind of designate some time now for that. But then as you finish that up, the rest of the class is yours. You're welcome to hang out here and work. If you want to chat with me about anything or have questions, that's cool. But otherwise, the rest of the class is yours. So let's go ahead and break up into our groups and chat. And then after that, it's all yours. Thanks, y'all. I'm going to drink my mason jar full of oranges. Yeah, I brought that. They're delicious.
I kind of do have a question.
Okay.
Sort of, I feel like I see this too, it's like either you don't have enough or it's like too much.
Mm.
And it's like trying to figure out.
So that's one of the things, like with overlapping action, that's why with offset, that's why I kind of break it up into its own part of the process. Like I don't offset a whole bunch of stuff as I'm going. I try to clean up the curves and then I offset, because it's really easy to undo it if it didn't work then, right? And it's really easy to try some stuff. Be like, I wonder what happens if I do this for 2 frames instead of 3 or instead of 1. And sometimes the answer is just like, no, that made it worse, Control Z, right? Well, I'm sorry, I feel like I kind of veered off from what the question was. Did that make sense? Okay. Yeah. But yeah, it's, what was the original question?
Oh, just like, yeah, it's like, and I guess too, it's like thinking with like 2D animation and how it's like maybe having this like feeling like you need to put in a lot of overlapping action, but then
Oh.
it just kind of gets like.
Yeah. Yeah, I think 2D is hard. I feel like you have to kind of start breaking it down a little differently than maybe you would 3D, because you don't get those automatic interpolations. And sometimes you may have a whole breakdown key that is just about that arm following through. One of the ways you can kind of do that is to just do the frames of the arm to see if that's working and save the previous frames. And then if it works, then you can go back and rework the body or whatever to sort of line up with that. Yeah, 2D is hard. Like it's actually probably the part of frame by frame animation that I struggle with the most. And I'd say probably the rest of you is the same too. It also has a little bit of a different threshold though. Like I think animators who are doing 2D recognize it's hard, and so like some of that stuff you're going to see a lot more of like the overlapping action and like the clothes and stuff like that, because that's the stuff that helps it. But one of the ways you can do that is sort of break up the parts that you know are going to have a lot of overlapping action into their own layer, especially on sort of your first pass of it. And like you could do like what I did with the character with the arms and legs, is you can, you know, some of those in betweening, you can break those up into multiple layers and then just merge those layers together at the end. And that's also why I usually do all my animation the first pass through as like stick figures pretty much.
Right.
Is because it's a little easier to erase parts of it and redo that, and then when you're drawing over top of it after that, it's like really you're just drawing the final character is just kind of like your render pass, right? You've already got all the animation figured out at that point. So, other questions? Okay, well hopefully this has been helpful. Going once. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video. Hopefully this worked, because sometimes it doesn't successfully record the PowerPoint presentation as well. But I think it did last class, so I think it will this class too. And I'll go ahead and put that up on YouTube so you can watch through it again if you want. So otherwise, the rest of the class is yours if y'all want to get together and get some feedback, and then do what you do.